Let's go ahead and get started with this conversation. I have these obscure tech figures here, Schmidt and Hoffman. Let's see, I better check the bio. Reid Hoffman, yes, co-founder of LinkedIn, co-founder of Inflection AI, a partner at Greylock on many boards. But I think perhaps most notable for our purposes is someone who has been following this set of issues in private sector developments very attentively, partly as an investor, but partly as someone who is both public-spirited and deeply interested in keeping his finger on the pulse of trends in innovation. Then Eric Schmidt, of course, who helped build Google, former CEO and chairman of Google, but perhaps, and also follows the private sector pretty closely, but perhaps most important for our purposes and not quite as well known in this area is that several years ago, Eric decided to begin devoting a lot of his time to public issues. He was on the President's Council of Science and Technology Advisors in the Obama administration. He began getting a lot of involvement in national defense issues. He helped create now nonprofits that work on defense strategy issues, and he's involved in a number of ways in trying to think about the national security of the United States and of democracies more generally. So very well suited to this conversation. So I'm going to kick off, I'm going to throw one ball in the air, and then I think Eric will kind of take over the management of the conversation from there. So the ball I'm going to throw in the air, which the two of you then can start batting, is this. It's like, among all the tech interests that you could get involved in, why did the two of you decide to get involved in the AI safety issues, and AI safety issues with a particular framing that both of you began articulating when I first heard it more than a year ago? So again, this is the vast menu of your interests and portfolio of concerns. Why did you seize on this, and why did you seize on this particular framing? I'll let you take it from there.
Thank you. I thought what we could start, Reid, was a couple questions to you, and then you could do the reverse to me. I'll try to be kind. We are best friends. What is going on now as an architectural matter? What is the name for this era that we're in? It's more than just LLMs.
It might be that most of the people in the audience know this, but we are, what we're fundamentally seeing is scale compute. It's scale compute, which also comes from scale data and scale teams. And it's one of the reasons why I've kind of characterized this as the cognitive industrial revolution. Just like the industrial revolution gave us superpowers in our muscles, superpowers in our transport, superpowers in our construction, logistics, everything else. This is giving us superpowers of the mind, of mental characteristics, of capabilities. And there's a reason that it's being driven commercially. First and foremost, this is just like the Industrial Revolution. While it has broad-ranging societal impact, it has broad-ranging national security questions, everything else, it is fundamentally reordering of kind of how do we drive our economies and how do we do things. Like, for example, the really excellent UK presentation kind of going through this question of where you are in various levels of engineers. The only thing I would add to it is between their yellow category, which I think we have line of sight to, and the very hard category, I think there's many more slices, and we may not even ever get to the very hard category, depending, but, little details. And I think that this question about this kind of scale compute is part of how this exponential curve is being done, which is we're making these massive data centers with a lot of power. It isn't just kind of, like Moore's law is exponential is not what's happening here. And by the way, that's a reminder that we have participated as a society in exponential curves before. Moore's law was going for decades. So it doesn't mean exponential means danger Will Robinson necessarily. It just means pay close attention. And so this kind of scale compute and the application and what it means for kind of the being able to do cognitive things, whether it's amplifying human beings, whether or not it's making certain automated systems, other kinds of things. That's the increase in capabilities that we're seeing, of which we saw a couple of different arcs, like, for example, the test evaluation that Jade really ran through well, and others as ways of kind of microcosms of what we're seeing.
So 2 more questions. So the next question is, you're a very well-known investor. You look a lot at the commercial structure. There was a question in the earlier panel about what's the structure of the industry. Give us a sense of the next 3 or 4 years. You're on the board of Microsoft, so presumably they're a winner, or at least you'll say that.
I believe it.
I'm a major shareholder of Google, so we'll have to acknowledge that. What are some other examples of winners? What does the structure look like? Is this a market that will consolidate quickly? Is this a market that will not consolidate quickly? You and I have both won playing network effect businesses. Is this a network effect business? And if so, how do the network effects work?
So I think the answer is there will be both massive wins from the large players and massive wins from startups, but the wins are not the same. So in the massive wins between the large players, which includes Google and Microsoft, I think includes OpenAI as part of what's going on itself and also with Microsoft, and I think has a number of other potential startups. I think that as you get to these really intense scale models, it becomes something that is, the frontier models become something that is heavily driven by the hyperscalers. So it's either...
Is that code for Microsoft?
Well, it's code for Google, Microsoft, and anyone else who's building massive amounts of compute.
Anthropic?
Anthropic is doing it with Amazon, and then Amazon Compute. Meta is doing massive scale compute, so there's a number.
Would Meta be one of those as well?
I think they are on track to be.
Okay.
All right, so I think that it's not a... on the network effects part of it, actually right now it's a scale effects versus a network effects. Those are not exactly the same.
Maybe we should define them because people get confused on these 2 points.
Yeah. So scale effects are, let's be tangible. If you want to be playing frontier model training this year, it's tens of thousands of GPUs, and next year it's 100,000 plus, and the year after that, it's more than that.
Okay, at $40,000 a CPU?
Yes.
$40 million?
Yep.
Then $4 billion?
Yes.
Really?
That's what I think what the pace setting is on the frontier models of scale compute. Now, part of what I was gesturing at is because there are multiples of these competing with each other, not just the least Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, but also obviously Amazon coming in, Oracle trying to do things, CoreWeave being supported by NVIDIA and making some great progress. You're going to have the provisioning of this across a large number of different providers who are competing with each other to provide these as APIs to startups. And that's one of the reasons why I think, there will be a variety of startups in. Now, while the scale of compute is a huge barrier, network effects is usually something that's more like, iMessage on your iPhone, or, kind of WhatsApp, or, these other things which have a kind of a network participation, LinkedIn is an example. And those have different levels of kind of compounding lock-in and other kinds of things in the domains that they're operating in. So I think scale compute allows new entrants if they can make the scale bar. Network effects are more defining. I think the network effects could be done by startups, which are using the scale thing to power applications. Like think of a new WhatsApp built on top of APIs or frontier models. I'm not saying that's the exact one you're going to see, but that's the reason why it's not necessarily a Google, Microsoft, et cetera only world, but they will have massive success here.
So you and I both got involved in this more than 2 years ago. There's a long history, this is to answer Phil's question, there's a long history with biologists in 1975 having a conference in Asilomar, which famously created something called the RAG, which is a regulatory group that ultimately became part of the government. And so we sort of studied this, and we had a non-specific worry. A lot of the conversation today has not been specific enough to my technical mind. Right? The framing is correct, but the details matter, and they matter a lot. Can you give some examples of real threats that we need to police, restrict, or other? What are the examples? Try to be as precise as you can be.
So I think until we got to the UK Institute presentation, I was going to have to introduce these concepts, but I think they did a bunch of it very well. So I'm going to be doubling down on some of that and adding a few things. So one is to think about these things as human amplifiers in the next X years. And so there's amplifiers of good human behavior, which obviously can include, medical, teaching, enabling, people who can't afford a lawyer to navigate legal circumstances, a bunch of other things, which are very good human amplification and we want as soon as possible. But then bad human amplification, that can be criminals, like the cyber threat that Jade and others went into in some depth. Terrorism, specifically bioterrorism, again, one of the things they went through, and there's a question about I think that's a risk anyway, but AI as the potential coach or, kind of steering you away from dead ends into things that could work is a concern. I think that the questions around electoral interference, which is gestured at the very beginning, which is generation of a lot of flooding with bad information. One of the things I think we'll see from the Russians in multiple democracies as part of their Ukraine and other battlefronts. And all of those, I think, are very real and upon us. And one of the reasons why I tend to push back on the other risks is because you say, well, the robots are coming for us with the exponentiated intelligence. I think there's a bunch of different questions there. Like, that's not to say it's 0% that there isn't some concerns there, but it's to say if you focus on those concerns versus these very tangible ones of what can AI do in the hands of antagonistic humans set to damage our systems and our societies is, I think, the real thing to focus on. And I think that those are the kinds of risks to focus on.
Your turn.
And by the way, feel free to to correct our little banter. But look, one of the things I think was, in a frame like this, when we're very focused, all the discussion has been on risk with some gestures, both from the US and the UK, about, look, it's very important about what we can do with medical and other kinds of things. Part of our having worked together closely is I know that you are an intense futurist. Namely, the future can be so much better than the now. Technology is an instance of it. And that let's not get lost in the discussion of how we navigate risks about how we're trying to get to the future. So in AI, where are you? Is you still as much of a futurist? Why? And what does the navigation course look like?
So it seems to me that the arrival of a new intelligence that's non-human and very powerful is like a really big deal. And I think that's what's happening. And it's happening in various different ways and so forth. And we have all the movies that we've seen and so forth. But the reality is you're already to some degree doing this. To do your work, you use a word processor, which amplifies your performance. It can actually change, improve your spelling, things like that. You use Google and other knowledge solutions because you can't remember everything, right? That makes you more powerful. This is just another step in making us more creative, powerful, so forth. And so some of these are actually originally ideas I got from you. Why don't we have an AI doctor for the world to help healthcare professionals bring them up. Like, let's start worrying about masses of people, making them better. Why don't we have an AI teacher to make the teachers more productive? I'm not replacing the teachers. We're making them more effective, teaching in the child's language and in the way that they learn best. There's example after example. I'm heavily involved in funding a whole bunch of programs in biology and physics and chemistry where these tools allow you to do approximations of functions, then answer questions that have never been answered before because they're incomputable. So if you care about health, if you care about education, if you care about new drug discovery, if you care about energy and in particular materials science and using less carbon and emissions and so forth and so on, AI is for you.
So the next question I'll first direct to Philip, and then we'll ask Eric as well. So we've had an excellent start to your conversation and summit. What would your takeaways be from what's been said on stage so far?
Well, brilliant, scintillating, culminating, of course, with the last panel, which was riveting.
And is now over.
Yes, I think that's when he's hitting the gong and the hook.
One big takeaway, I think, for people who did this is it's just an introduction of kind of what's going on and how are people starting to set the agendas and how are some of the institutions starting to shape out. So there's that. What I would call out is I keep hammering at the national security side of this. See, because the natural paradigm that everyone is falling into, the default paradigm is companies are building potentially dangerous stuff. How do we manage them and that? And that's an easy paradigm for folks to understand. The notion that these are immensely powerful tools that amplify, don't just amplify ordinary humans, but amplify the worst governments in the world. And then the notion that I may need good AI to beat bad AI. That then actually shifts the burden of doing the most advanced research away from the companies. It means that government will need research that's being done beyond what interests the companies, because the government needs to actually explore the worst cases and figure out how to counter them, and that's not what Microsoft is trying to do. And yet the government can't do it without Microsoft's help. That issue set, which I think is 1 or 2 years out, the two of you would know better. I think that issue set doesn't emerge as clearly from the discussions we've had so far. I tried to hesitantly introduce it at the beginning, but because the natural tendency is to fall back into the default paradigm and then to worry mostly about rogues, criminals, terrorists, and of that kind, and their ability to misuse. I will say that Eric and Bengio touched on one other dimension, which is when Eric used that term non-human intelligence, that's actually a very important concept, is that they're not just an amplification of us, they actually are different. And Bengio was trying to get at that, but just in the limited sense of, and they might have purposes of their own, and our control may be imperfect. But you actually have written a lot and thought a lot about what it means to contemplate an extremely powerful non-human intelligence for which our natural cognitive analogies don't actually fit very well.
So if I can answer, and if I'd like to give sort of a two-part answer. I'd like to answer the question and then answer a slightly different question. I guess an old trick. On the question of what are the takeaways, I continue to be reminded that Europe is not going to lead. And I'm sorry to be obnoxious. A regulatory first structure pretty much guarantees that you can't invent this stuff because there's too many unknowns. And I can give you all the details, but fundamentally, I'm an investor in the French companies. They spend all day battling with Brussels. If you go back to what Reid said about scale compute, which I agree with, because he's always right, where are the places where scale compute can be built? This is analogous to where can you build your cyclotrons, right, in physics and so forth. You can't do physics of that kind without a cyclotron. At the time, you had to move there. It's the same kind of thing. And so one of the ways to say it is that the United States, with its ally, the UK, and maybe the Five Eyes, will clearly be leading in this area because we have the capability and the need to build these large systems as a nation through companies and so forth. It's also clear to me that China will. And they will for all the same reasons that you can imagine I would give you for the United States. In a situation where you have this massive competition, I didn't say war, I just said competition between the Western models and the Chinese models, which will obviously be very different, where does everyone else fit in? And that's sort of a core question to start thinking about. How do people align themselves? Now, I'm sitting there in an arrogant way telling you that everyone's going to have to align, but that's how important this stuff is. And I want to then answer the other part of the question, which is what's going to happen next. And in the sense of saying the other things that you all did not talk about are what's coming soon. As a general comment, I've worked in various forms of regulation, online regulation for 30 years. And there are many reasonable, predictable liberal concerns, right? All of which are perfectly reasonable to be worried about. Let's start with bias, right? Human biases, redressing, these are all very reasonable, right? Notice we're not talking about them now. We're talking about existential threats. And you use the example of accelerating a human. You know, you have an evil human who doesn't understand biology, and there's plenty of evidence that and one of the things that we spent the last year fighting over is people said, well, it's the same thing as what's on Google. Well, the difference is it is on Google, but you have to have a PhD in biology to be able to use it. Whereas these systems take somebody who does not have a PhD in biology and gives them the recipe. That's a very real issue. So what's the next set of issues? I think there are three. And I can't tell you how this will play out, but I'm quite sure this will happen. So the first thing is that there's something called the context window, which is the number of tokens that you feed. The term that you all have heard is prompt engineering. The belief in the industry is that today you can get to 1 million tokens in the context that is 1 million in the questions. That's 20 books. In Phil's case, maybe 10 books, but you get the idea. But imagine taking 10 books from Phil and saying, what did he actually say because he wrote so long, right? That's sort of a simple example. It looks like there are breakthroughs this year that will allow for an infinite context window. And what that means is that you can take the answer of a question and feed it in as the next question. So the way this would work is, I'll use a negative example because they're always more frightening. I want to sort of do a terrible drug. What's the first step? Okay, it says assemble this. And then I take the answer and I feed it back in my query and say, that's the answer to part A, what's my next step? And then you take the next step and you feed it in. You see the recursion, right? And that's how these models will remain current. A way of thinking about the context window is its short-term memory. Well, this thing has a short-term memory that's infinite. Your short-term memory ends with seven digits, the best we can tell, right, as humans, ours. That's point one. Point two are the development of agents. Agents are not fully specified today in the industry, but everyone agrees, and Jade mentioned it to her in her excellent presentation, that the ability to call an agent in the middle of a computation increases the power of these models enormous ways. And so a simple example is you can say, go learn something about chemistry, and it's a large language model. One way to think of it is a large language model with memory. It keeps learning. So the development of these agents, and there will ultimately be the equivalent of a GitHub for agents, right? How do we characterize these agents? How do we deal with them? I don't know. But they're going to be very powerful. They're not going to be like turn on and off the lights. And then the third one, my favorite, is called text to action. And this is where you say something and it writes a program. And the LLMs, in a bizarre way, are good enough to write Python programs, which I find shocking. And there's folks that are working very hard to make that kind of programming much more powerful than straightforward Python. And in the industry, there is a belief that people will be able to verbally say, make me my own search engine, and it'll know enough to build a UI, do web search, do crawl, do ranking, and so forth, and it probably would ignore all the laws, right? Is that good or bad? But the point is that if everyone can make their own search engine, what happens? I'll give you another example. The government bans TikTok in the United States. We'll see if that happens. So somebody, nobody in this room, says to the system, make me my own copy of TikTok, steal all the music, make it sound with my values, release it in 1 minute. If it's not viral, do it again in an hour. And do it 24 hours a day until you hit virality. And by the way, if you actually hit virality, hire a whole bunch of lawyers to clean up all the legal mess you just created. And I'm not endorsing illegal stealing and anything in my comment. I'm using it as a theoretical example. Don't sue me. So my point here is, I don't think we have any model for human productivity of the kind that I'm describing. If everyone can have their own programmer that actually does what they want, as opposed to the programmers I manage, can you imagine, right? Make me a this, make me a that, right? So these things are far, far more powerful, in my view, than is conceived in this conversation. That would be my feedback.
So let me take advantage of the way the two of you watch the sector. Just talk a little bit about what you see, what the landscape is as to who's building what over the next year or two, including multinationally, and how you see the open source picture shaping up. Are the open source companies going to be able to keep pace? And how do you see the global set?
I'll give a quick answer, and Reed can give a correct answer. First place, each day I alternate on the question of, is open source getting closer or farther away from the frontier models? The frontier models are the big ones. The argument in favor of the frontier models is that the amount of capital required is so large, right, that you can't give it away, or you cannot raise the money. There's evidence of that. This morning, for example, Cohere announced a new model, which they claim is 6th in the ranking of cognition from all the top models, and Cohere is an open source model. So I think we just don't know. But a simple answer is that there will be a relatively small number of very large models. Reed already named them. And the determination of the number of open source models will be a function of the capital cost to build them and how do they raise the money. Reed?
So we're so early, we actually don't, people haven't really been doing a lot of performance tuning. I mean, they've been doing performance tuning of the inference, but not performance tuning of, well, if you use this set of data, you get a better outcome. If you redo the training, like, for example, you can train GPT-4 quality now cheaper than you could train it when they first did it, because we've learned a bunch. So that means that there will be continued open source progress in various ways. And it's one of the reasons we have to pay attention to the issues around open source, because I was on the board of Mozilla for 11 years. At LinkedIn, we open sourced a bunch of different projects. I'm a very strong advocate of open source in various ways, but the open sourcing the models have a different set of society and security risks than open sourcing software. And so, Henry also gestured at the fact that there's, a bunch of these things are also being run in China in various ways that are open sourced, fundamentally American models, and Mistral too, which is a quality model generator in France. So open source will continue to progress. So then people say, hey, the gap is closing. But what they really are not tracking is that the frontier models go in these large jumps. And so it looks like the gap's closing until the next frontier model then suddenly does something really amazing. And part of what we've seen in the progress of these frontier models so far is that, for example, comparing GPT-4 and GPT-3 and 3.5, when you had 3 and 3.5 that were fine-tuned to a specific application, 4 was still better than 3 and 3.5. So that scale, so far of what we've seen, really matters. And so, for example, if you take I thought it was a good arc to say, what is the progress of quality of engineering that these can do? Is, I think, a good lens. Eric echoed the Python version of that. There's others, what Jade was saying as well. And I think that this is a good kind of perspective on how these are going, and the next larger frontier models will just be much better engineers. Are you about to say something?
So I think, first place, there's a bit of the background. One of the things that we did is we had my own background is also open source. My entire career has been open source. And so I'm sitting there talking to a leading computer science researcher who is very pro open source. And his answer is, the best way to make the world safer is to release the models so you can see everything, and then allow people to build AI systems that attack the bad AI systems. That was his formulation. And Phil knows this very well. The problem with that is in military context, which I now know a lot about, it's better to be on offense than defense. And that the capability of a single bad actor with an unconstrained open source model that's very powerful, which we don't have today, but which may be coming, could be quite significant before the AI can counter it. So this is why it's a very legitimate concern. The argument on scale, the reason I oscillate at different frequencies, is that it looks like federated training, we're technically called mixture of experts models, may actually allow you to have, instead of one huge data center, you can have a set of models and assemble them. And this is technology that's being developed this year. We will see. I think we don't know. I have always believed in the last decade that there would end up being 5 or so very large models that are inventing the future of science, of intelligence, of whatever. That this is the definition of AGI. This is my personal opinion. And that those machines will be so powerful that they'll be like our plutonium plants in America, which I have visited, which are on a military base, and they actually have another fence around them. And there's a guard that is ready to shoot you if you misuse the API. Because these things are, and I'm not being facetious, unfortunately, and the reason is that when you think to the extent of their ability to do planning well ahead of humans, they do become national security assets. Today, you would say that there'll be a few in the US, there'll be at least one, and a few maybe in China, and we don't know. So the question of concentration of power, which is sort of this debate, is much more important than it initially sounds. Because if you think that the ultimate path is a very small number of incredibly powerful, incredibly useful, and incredibly dangerous computers, you have a completely different regulatory regime that if you think this thing will peter out at some scale.
And then to wrap back to your very first question and give a little bit of an answer to that. So I see us on this commercial path that's, like the steam engine, like the Industrial Revolution, much more compressed time. There's a lot of reasons why it's fundamentally being driven by the private sector. And I think the only hope for the government to get involved is through private-public partnership, right? E.g., what you were gesturing at, work with Microsoft, work with Google. I don't think the government's capable of standing up something at the pacing and level that companies competing with each other, and they're not just competing with each other in the US. This is obviously the top mandate in China for what's going on. And so given that, part of the reason why I think both Eric and I got involved in the safety part of the discussion as well is to say, well, this is going to be the drumbeat by which is coming out. I think there's a lot of natural good things that come out. AI medical assistants, AI tutors, free translation being, enabled, a whole bunch of other things that are natural commercial outcomes for this. But obviously there's commercial blind spots. And so how do we make sure that those blind spots are well navigated? Because the questions around okay, so what about some of the unintended things, whether it's, enabling criminals, whether it's enabling rogue states, whether it's, kind of other kinds of negative impacts. How do we navigate that and mitigate that as best as possible, and do so in collaboration with governments, universities, other things? That's part of the reason why Eric and I, show up at conferences like this excellent one you're hosting and try to help, because that's an important part of how the drumbeat's going. And the timing of this is not set by, random people at Google, random people at Microsoft, random people at OpenAI. It's set by essentially global commercial competition, and that's the time frames that we need to operate in. And so, helping with the network of connectivity around how do you address the key issues and make sure that those, like what you were saying in your opening presentation, like the mega risks, the real strong impacts are navigated as much as possible, and everything else we can learn and iterate as we go.
So let me come back to the question of the private sector. And so here are these companies, and some of the companies famously have said, we're trying to be socially careful. We're investing some serious money. And some companies maybe are serious, maybe some of them are not so serious. For sure, the companies probably with which you're most intimately involved are somewhat serious. But talk a little bit about how do you want us to understand the private sector's, the private companies' commitment to social good? And how much should we trust them?
So it's very common to say, because there's some issues in which you can mistrust corporations or some corporations, then you should mistrust all. But by the way, part of when you're talking about trust of any organization, you're talking about trust for what and how far, because you can't trust government infinitely. You can't trust universities infinitely, right? You can't trust companies infinitely. It's a question of interrelation. And one of the things that usually goes too fast without commentaries in corporations, there are networks of accountability other than regulation. There's networks of accountability with customers. There's networks of accountability with employees. Part of the thing that when we've managed organizations, both Eric and I have had this experience, you have an entire employee base of would-be whistleblowers if you're doing something bad or you're doing something that countervenes your public statements about what you're doing, right? So, and that kind of wraps into the fifth estate. There's shareholders, there's long-term brand management. That doesn't mean there isn't a role also for regulation. That doesn't mean there isn't a definite role for universities thinking about this and asking questions. That's the reason why it's networks of human accountability across all of these systems. So someone who'd said you should trust all companies all the times, that's ludicrous. We've all seen bad actor companies and individuals, but it's similarly ludicrous to say you should mistrust all companies all the time, right? That's kind of like saying, well, let's mistrust all organizations, all institutions, because all have had some failure points and all have some blind spots, including, by the way, government, right? To be super clear, not to, you've had much more experience with government than I have. And so I think the question is, how do we make those networks of accountability work? And part of what I think is like, for example, a classic one is to say the most important issue is the concentration of power in a small number of tech companies. That's the most important issue we need to address. And it's like, well, it depends. If they're actually, in fact, we're going from, call it 5 to 7 large tech companies to 10 to 12, and they're competing intensely with each other, that may be as designed and as good. And the more important government issue may not be it's concentration of this tech power. The more important issue might be, you have a line of sight to a medical assistant in every smartphone. How do we get that in as many people's hands as possible and alleviate the suffering? You have a line of sight to an infinitely patient tutor on any subject to any age human being. How do we get that on every smartphone? How do we make sure that benefits the billions of people who don't otherwise have access to it? That may actually be the more relevant question. And so part of the question here is not to say well, can we trust companies? Because, by the way, you can trust companies to try to offer good products and try to increase their long-term stock value. And that, by the way, means various forms of accountability. That doesn't mean you can trust them on everything all the time, but there's no human institution that you can trust on everything all the time, and that's why we interleave them. That's part of the reason why these institutes are an extremely good idea and an important thing to do. That's the reason why some regulation is important. And by the way, a bunch of companies have shown up, and I thought the White House did an excellent job of first, let's ask for voluntary commitments, let's have dialogues, let's get the voluntary commitments out, then let's strengthen them with an executive order, let's try to do the line towards what kinds of regulation we might do. I thought that was a very, very good dynamic process, being very well led by Secretary Raimondo and a bunch of others within the White House, and I think that's an excellent thing to be doing. That doesn't mean that you should trust 0, and doesn't mean you should trust 100. It means you should be more nuanced and set up these networks of accountability.
Okay, let's open the floor to questions.
Hi, Susan Rice, and thank you for this great panel, and Phil, thank you for organizing a tremendous day. I'd love to hear more about the public-private partnership concept and how you envision it being structured and how we get from here to there. If, Eric, we're ultimately heading to 5 to 7 companies or models ring-fenced under some kind of secure control, is that through a voluntary relationship that the companies enter into with government, or through some other kinds of means? How do we get from here to there?
You understand this area better than anyone in the audience. So the first thing is, we're going to have to get better alignment of interests between the national security world and the government and the companies. And the best way, speaking as a former CEO, is to do it with money, right? Legally, to have purchases and programs and so forth, which get the money from the government into the companies to do things that help in national security. That's the first thing. Now, in this particular area, which again, you're a genuine expert in, there's so many things in national security that a powerful AI could do to help defend our country. Right? I mean, I can just example after example after example, start with threat monitoring, doing all sorts of game analysis, doing strategic analysis, and eventually doing even offensive things and generating them on an on-demand basis. So the alignment there is important. I've spent lots of time talking to the various governments around the world. All of them have trouble getting people who want to work in the private sector to work for them. So you're much, much better taking the things the government has, which is regulatory power and money as an incentive, and use that to solve a problem that the government has that is important, that the companies can do. That's my solution. Now, you could imagine a reckless large company, which I don't think will happen, that eventually did something really, really stupid. Think of it, Google or Microsoft did something incredibly stupid and became essentially captured because the danger was so great. They're not going to make that mistake. So it's much more likely that the partnership would be, let's think of the D&I, sort of at the D&I level as opposed to the commerce level, and do it from a national security perspective, because that's the legitimate role of the federal government in terms of keeping us safe.
So adding a few things to that, and obviously flows of money are one of the things that companies are all designed around, so that's part of the wisdom of Eric's answer. But there's additional things too in terms of how the companies operate. So Phil started with a kind of an excellent précis on safe harbor, and you could see, for example, the U.S. government or U.S., UK, others working together, say, hey, we will offer a safe harbor if you operate within these parameters, which might have some national security help and other kinds of things, and that might be part of a safe harbor. One of the things that's being worked on pretty intensely, so when I get advice to governments about things they could do that could make the hyperscaler companies that would be on offer. I mean, there's always money, although these companies do have a lot of money, so the money that moves the needle for them is very large. But for example, one of the things they're all on the hunt for right now is available power for data centers, right? So it's like, hey, we will help you sort out some of the data center and power issues. In return, help us with the following, right?
By the way, I heard a rumor that the power regulatory structure in our bases, Army bases and so forth, is actually quite different in terms of what you can build and what you can do. So there's a good example, right? Give us a corner of one of these unused bases in return for a national security benefit. That's the kind of thinking that I think we need.
And part of what I encourage in all of this is to think about be a little bit like Eric's question to me, being concrete about what we want is we want to make sure that we have, for example, to borrow from Philip's earlier and I think very good thing is like, we want the following kinds of good AI to help leverage against bad AI, and we want that to be part of what you're developing for us and make it work. And here we will enable you in these following ways, but getting precise in that.
Brilliant, thank you. Tim Henderson, former submarine officer. Question for Eric. I hypothesize that completely autonomous weapons will become the sine qua non of great power warfare within the next 30 years. And a lot of people oppose this, the Pope, the UN, the majority of the population when surveyed. And parenthetically, I think it's a great tragedy that we can't adhere to that. But written U.S. policy, DOD 3000.09, is ambiguous, but it's currently interpreted to mean that you must have a human on the loop at a minimum. But I believe that construct is going to evaporate in the next 9/11, next Pearl Harbor. So wouldn't it be more, my question, wouldn't it be more honest, wouldn't it be more democratic to have that debate now rather than waiting for the next 9/11?
So we had that debate as part of our AI commission. I headed this National Security Commission on AI. And the distinction that I agree with everything you said in terms of human on the loop and so forth. And it's interesting to look at the edge cases. So an example would be that we have weapons today that a human authorizes the launch, but then they vary their target based on calculations while they're in flight. And that's perfectly legal. Another example is what is called coordinated attack, where a bunch of stuff, again, against a known and legitimate target named by a human, it's legal to have the weapons coordinate to hit a single target. That's another example. So I'm going to disagree just slightly and say that I think we can preserve 3000.09 and human on the loop as long as basically the following is true. As a legal matter, we know there is a target over there. We know it's an enemy target. We know that there's very little or no collateral damage involving in hitting it. And we can do so in a reasonably automated way once it's authorized. Now, that is not the same thing as an automatic weapon system. And my guess is we can get through that. There is a line of thinking in the military that says that in a real war, a real shooting war, that you'll get an automated war in the sense that the systems will make their own targeting decisions. There's a bunch of reasons that it's not going to happen. First, our military is not advanced enough to build those systems, and it'll be a long time. I was pro-Maven, so you understand my point of view on this. And the second thing is that I'm not sure we need to do it given the likelihoods of error. You shouldn't use these AI systems in life-critical situations. You should have a human controlling them. That's why I'm not going to be flying on a pilotless airplane anytime soon as a human. And so I think it's highly unlikely we'll cross the boundary from human control to not human control, given the inherent inaccuracy and hallucination of these models. That may change.
Anya.
I just want to associate myself with Susan's comments. Philip, you put together an amazing conference, and thank you to the two of you for being here and really getting into the meat of these issues. I want to pick up what Eric, I think all three of you have touched on, which is this idea that the geopolitical competition is becoming intense between a US and UK-centric world AI ecosystem and a China-centric one. And there are a lot of wealthy middle powers there who don't have a clear allegiance, who are trying to get in the game, Saudi Arabia, UAE among of them. When I think, just starting to think this through, I think there's two options here. One is either US, UK, Europe, go it alone, try to build all the biggest models, maybe have the US government and others help with the electricity generation, the compute, everything that's going to be needed. Two, create a values-based ecosystem around AI, kind of on the lines what Henry and Ollie and Jade and others are trying to do, but make it more closed. You say, hey, if you come into the light side, we'll work with you, but if not, we won't. Do you see that as the dichotomy? Do you have other ideas? How would you think about this geopolitics?
So I've been working on this. The Trump administration, followed by the Biden administration, put hard restrictions on economics and chips and ASML and so forth with respect to China. So that's an example of the US using hard power, right, in the sense of a no, in order to advantage us and our allies against China. That's a good example, and I think it's generally working, right? It sort of ultimately will be seen as a reasonable decision. The next question is, what do you do with all the other countries? And they don't have the same security practices. They don't have an example. So the thought experiment is you have a wacky country that has a lot of money, and they're doing model training, and they end up doing something which is pretty important, and they promise it's safe, but they're riddled with agents from Russia, right, as an example. How do you feel about that? And we don't today have a language for what to do about that. Whenever I'm asked this question, I always say, think Canada. They're very nice, and they have a lot of hydropower, and they're near us, right? So there's this core question of where will the models get built, and what are the rules about high-end training? Now, because of open source, the 100 billion parameter models, which I'm going to call the mid-size models, are essentially out there. As we said earlier on this panel, last time I was in China, every initiative I met with had started with an open source model. So don't fool yourself, right? When you release an open source model, you're giving it straight to everybody in the world, including people you may or may not like. And we don't today have a policy for the question of training in countries who are allies but not secure allies. And that the government has got to sort out.
I think the thing I would add to Eric's answer to your excellent question, Anya, is that we have an opportunity now to reinforce some of, I think, our positive alliances, and I think we should take that. That doesn't mean slow down, because the farthest ahead I've heard any estimate about where the kind of leading companies are on the whole rest of the world is 2 years. So it's 2 years or less. That's not a lot of time. And so it's not slowing down for the things that are going on. But I do think that the question about how do you identify what are the really key things, it's one of the things I loved about, the detailed presentation from our British friends. It's like, look, we're identifying what are the key things, we're working on them, we're working with how does the public-private work, how do we participate in a good way. We're not certifying safe, we're just trying to catalyze this in the right way. And I think that's the kind of thing as a similar pattern, the US, Western democracies could then do as a kind of leading the way, talking to all the folks that you're identifying as the mid-powers. I don't think it's going to be very difficult to get to saying we allow major models to be trained in places that there isn't security, but there might be ways of saying here's how we can share some versions of ownership, inference, runtime, other kinds of things.
And you have to be careful not to screw this up by being too regulatory, because if you ban their training, they'll just use the upcoming Huawei chip from China and spend twice as much, and off they go. So it's a balance of interests. To me, the interesting question is India. We globally will benefit from the development of AI in India because of its productivity, the number of people, its economic growth, so forth and so on, and as a counterweight to China. It's crucial that that be done in a way that we're comfortable with. And I think that should be a good priority, right? There are a whole bunch of other, I'm assuming that Japan and Korea will follow well with what we're doing. I'm not worried about them, but I would take a look at what do you do geopolitically with India.
Hi, my name is Ash. Thank you so much for joining us. I work here at the Hoover Institution. I had a thought during your talk, and I was hoping you might tell me why I'm wrong. And the thought was basically like that we've exhausted the easily accessible, publicly available data on which to train these foundation models. And so like OpenAI has done a great job scraping the entire internet, which obviously has a lot of knowledge, but like a ton of stuff that is necessary for these models to learn what you want them to be able to do. Like you said, replicate TikTok, for example, require access to data that's not publicly available or accessible and likely maybe won't be, like, for example, like LinkedIn's tech stack or something. So I guess my question is like, even though we're following these scaling laws, are there like data limits that kind of are going to slow the progress?
I don't agree with the premise of your question that we're running out of language to train on. I think there's, just start by watching all the YouTube videos. That'll destroy your day. So I think there's lots of language to be trained on. There is a very serious shortage in science, in particular in biology, physics, chemistry, where basically the data doesn't exist. It's never been measured. And the data that does exist is behind firewalls or in industrial companies or so forth. I think that from a standpoint of language, we're going to be fine. There's plenty of stuff. Plus, we generate a lot of language every day. Furthermore, if you don't like it, you can just generate synthetic language. We know how to do that. That's what these systems are doing.
Yeah, I mean, that was, there's going to be a bunch of different work going on synthetic data creation. There's also a bunch of different work going on in like, okay, how do you unlock key other elements of data that can train very useful information? And one subheader on the synthetic data is if you figure out how to say, okay, here we can take, for example, a whole swath of medical data, and we can run it through a transformer so there is no personal identifiable information. It creates a new layer of synthetic information, but that synthetic information is trainable on. That creates new opportunities too. So the people are looking at this problem and working on it, and I share Eric's optimism that there may be some bumps, but it's solvable problems.
All right, one more question. This gentleman right there.
Hi, so sort of piggybacking off of that question, when you're looking at training language models, a lot of the training that's really useful for them, like the instruction fine-tuning, the RLHF, it's very human-centered. You need a human to generate the training pairs or align the models. And so if you look at trying to train a model to be a good doctor, you would need a doctor to help it out, or a lawyer to help it write legal documents. And if you look at that paradigm, it seems like it lends itself to, you're going to have like very domain-specific LLMs, right? Where you'll have a few winners for the healthcare space, the legal space, so on and so forth. So what I'm curious about is you mentioned that there's going to be like 5 winners overall for generalist intelligence. I'm curious, does generalist intelligence ever come about? Is it going to be an antitrust issue? Like, you would need to go to all of these professions and figure it out. So it seems to run a little counter, right?
First, we don't know. I'm speculating on the 5. A simple model is that both things can be true at the same time. There can be these large, incredibly powerful, incredibly interesting things that invent all sorts of new stuff, right, which is the goal of AGI. And then there are very, very large businesses that don't use them. And let me tell you why they don't use them. The last thing I want is my advertising system to be learning about advertising while it's delivering ads, right? Imagine if it learns the wrong thing and I lose my top customer. So there's lots of reasons to think that in its use, the tactical embedding of these systems will be much more constrained. And you gave a good example. With health, you don't want it doing medical research while it's giving advice to the doctor. You want the medical research to be in one LLM, and you want the doctor thing to have been certified. And you can imagine eventually, in addition to using RLHF, the doctors will actually have to certify that the answers, to the degree that we can prove it, are medically accurate, because people die if you make a mistake. So I think because of the hallucinations, because of the imprecision, also you have issues of latency, inference time, all that kind of stuff. I think both can be true.
Look, this has been a wonderful session, and thank you for joining us for the conversation about the private sector and then some. And thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon, and this focus today, again, was on AI safety here at the Hoover Institution and the policy challenge of AI safety. Tomorrow, Stanford HAI is running a day-long symposium that's taking a very broad look about AI and society, that including the issues of other parts of the world, how do different regions relate to these issues, other kinds of issues that we haven't discussed as much today, like election interference and so forth. So that's a really useful symposium that they'll be having tomorrow. But for now, thank you for joining us this afternoon at the Hoover Institution.